in a couple of years, you'll be at university and you'll have professors teaching you who've been studying one specific thing in one subject area for 10 or 20 or 30 or 40 years. Now, if that subject area, if that topic, if that discipline wasn't complex enough to sustain that level of study, right? Like the professor knows everything they need to know after 5 years and then, is doing what for the next decades. No, these subject areas are complex. If you're doing a bachelor's degree and studying for 3 or 4 years in academia, or if you're doing a master's or a PhD or postdoctorate and you're actually spending your life as a professor doing research, the idea is the world is complex. Let's look closely and try to understand those complexities. Young students tend to think that research is sort of going to the library or Google or JSTOR and looking for evidence that just supports your opinion. But in academia, the assumption is that research really requires a truly open mind. It's sort of fueled by curiosity, critical thinking, and ultimately rigor, right? That you come with an open mind, that you try to understand the influential, the critical perspectives of scholars that have come before you, thinkers that have come before you. The research actually informs the perspective you have, not that you come with an opinion and you're just trying to justify it. So we say the world is complex. Let's look closely and try to understand those complexities. This brings us to the second point, which is that academic disciplines use methodologies. Now, this is the big difference between a personal project in the MYP and the extended essay in the DP. For a personal project, you're exploring something that's interesting to you or something you know about or care about. But for the extended essay, now you're entering academia and you have to apply methodologies from the subject area, from the academic discipline in which you're doing your extended essay. What kinds of things do you do as a geographer or a historian or a biologist or a sociologist? In those subject areas, you have methodologies. And on your extended essay, that's criterion A, right? Focus and methodology. You have to actually apply those methodologies in your essay. So when we talk about methodologies, there's a lot of crossover with TOK here, right? Like what constitutes knowledge creation in the hard sciences versus the social sciences or in the arts, right? And what kinds of methodologies are used to produce knowledge and to share knowledge. In this regard, we're not talking about opinions. It's not just opinions, right? Rather, you're looking at data and you're applying a methodology to a set of data to come to a higher understanding. An extended essay can't just be you writing 4,000 words about what you think of the lives of women in Kampala or the traffic congestion in London or the post-apartheid regimes in South Africa. If you want to do that, you can do that. You can publish that on your blog, or you can submit it to the newspaper as an op-ed if you want. And maybe that's very interesting. Maybe your ideas are very interesting, but there's no methodology there. There's no academic methodology. So this brings us to the third point. Graf and Birkenstein basically argue that all academic writing, regardless of the subject area, comes down to the very simple and elegant and beautiful they say, I say. So they propose a kind of thought experiment where you enter a room and in that room there are scholars discussing a question. And the discussion may have gone on for decades or it may have gone on for millennia. Your job is to come in with an open mind, to listen carefully and closely, but you're a human, so you can't help your brain from thinking, right? And thinking critically. And so as you're thinking critically and evaluating and analyzing the arguments, at some point you're going to move from the they say, here are the different perspectives, to actually contributing your own truth to that, your own thinking to that. That's the I say part. The implication is that knowledge doesn't happen in a vacuum, that rather in academia, knowledge is created in the context of discourse. So with Graf and Birkenstein, you start with a kind of research, right, where you understand the expert perspectives, the most influential scholars, but then ultimately there's the evaluation piece of that. And you see in your in the criteria, the third strand, discussion, evaluation, is excellent, right? That is sort of what we're talking about here, where you're not just saying scholar A argues this, scholar B argues something different, scholar C argues something altogether different, right? But you're actually evaluating those perspectives. And that sort of brings us to the fourth point, which is this sort of notion that we're borrowing of the dialectic from Hegel, sort of 19th century German philosopher. And the idea is that you start with a thesis, right? At the end of your research, you're going to come to a kind of argument. All extended essays will argue something, right? They're not book reports. You don't present the thinking of other people, but ultimately your research will lead you to a kind of, your research and your critical thinking will lead you to a kind of thesis, an argument that you're making. So by the time we get to the end of your introduction in your extended essay, we'll know exactly what you're arguing, not just the topic, but what your argument is. By the time we come to the body, you'll systematically substantiate and justify that argument, providing evidence, evaluating and analyzing that evidence in a very systematic kind of way. Now, this is the point that a lot of students sort of stop. They substantiate, they know that they should provide evidence in support of their argument, but what we can borrow from this idea of the dialectic is introducing the antithesis, right? And you can do that using the they say, I say formula, where it's essentially, you might say something like, however, many influential scholars have argued X, and then you evaluate the value of that argument is, but the limitation is something else, right? What these scholars miss is, or what these scholars leave out is A, B, and C. In some classrooms and textbooks, you might hear the expression addressing counterclaims. This is fine, and in a way, this antithesis is sort of what you're doing, but I think the model of the dialectic works better because when you're addressing a counterclaim, it can feel superficial, right? Some scholars would argue X, but they're wrong, right? You haven't engaged very closely with what they're arguing. Now, some essays won't provide this, and as an examiner, you read the essay and you're thinking, oh my gosh, are they going to mention X? Are they going to mention X? Are they going to mention X? You come to the end and you're thinking, oh my goodness, how did this student not acknowledge the elephant in the room, right? These influential scholars who've sort of that would sort of complicate the simplicity of the argument that the student has put forward. So the antithesis is a way to sort of complicate your argument. Ultimately, though, according to this model, we have a thesis and we have the antithesis. But ultimately, and these are sort of they seem to be in opposition with one another, right? But through your critical thinking, your evaluation, you want to come to a synthesis. In Hegel's model, what we mean when we say synthesis is a kind of higher understanding, an understanding that actually encompasses both thesis and antithesis. The thing about Criterion C is this is where all your points are, right? It's the difference between, yes, this is an essay, and this is a really good essay. The presentation criteria, for example, is just, does it look like an essay? Does it smell like an essay? Does it taste like an essay? Whereas the critical thinking is worth a lot more points and sort of separates the really good ones from ones that are less good.